Greetings and welcome everyone to the 2024 REL Distinguished Lecture Series organized by the Department of Religious Study at the University of West. My name is Miro Sake, Chair of the Department of Religious Study. Before I introduce our distinguished guest speaker, I will take a moment to share a few words about the University of West. So the University of West, which was the first university and the only one in the United States founded by Venerable Master Xingyun of the Fokwansan order in Taiwan. And the university is regionally accredited and non-profit, providing the whole person education informed by Buddhist wisdom and value. It facilitates cultural understanding and appreciation between East and West, while keeping tuition affordable to serve as many students as possible. The university offers master's and PhD program in religious study, focusing on Buddhist studies, as well as a master's in Buddhist chaplaincy and a doctor of Buddhist ministry. Additionally, it has online programs such as master's in Buddhist spiritual care and a certificate in Buddhist counseling. So you can learn more on our website, www.us.edu. So today, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. So Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk from New York City, born in 1944. He obtained a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College and a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate School. After completing his university study, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973, both under the leading Sri Lankan scholar monk Venerable Balong Goda and the Maitreya. From 1984 to 2002, he was the editor for the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy, where he lived for 10 years with a senior German monk, Venerable Nyanapo Nika Thera, at the Forest Hermitage. He returned to the United States in 2002. He currently lives and teaches at Chuan Inn Monastery in Carmel, New York. Bhikkhu Bodhi has many important publications to his credit, either as author, translator, or editor. And these include Middle-length Discourse of the Buddha, Majjhima Nikaya in 1995, the Connected Discourses of the Buddha, Samyutta Nikaya 2000, and the Numeral Discourses of the Buddha, Anuttar Nikaya 2012. In 2008, together with several of his students, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi founded Buddhist Global Relief, a non-profit supporting hunger relief, sustainable agriculture, and education in countries suffering from chronic poverty and malnutrition. So the topic for today's lecture, a directly visible Dhamma. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Okay, so first I want to thank Professor Miroj Shakya and the University of the West for inviting me to give this lecture or talk this afternoon.
Great pleasure.
And already I see a number of familiar names and faces on the Zoom panel. Some of the people who come from my Saturday class, I see them here as well. So I hope this doesn't seem boring, because I'll be going over some of the material that I've covered on the Saturday class. Okay, so the topic that I chose for this talk is, in English, it's a directly visible Dhamma, and in Pali would be Sanditthiko Dhammo. And the reason I chose this topic first is because, we have the sort of basis of Buddhist practice, Buddhist cultivation, is the going for refuge to the three refuges, or the three jewels. And of the three refuges, the heart of the refuge is the Dhamma. So the Buddha, we could say, is a refuge because he has become enlightened to the Dhamma and teaches the Dhamma. And the Sangha is a refuge because they practice, realize, and transmit the Dhamma. But the actual practice that we have to undertake to understand the nature of things, to gain realization and to gain liberation, is the Dhamma itself. So we want to say what is really involved in the Dhamma in which we take refuge. In the text of early Buddhism, there's a set of contemplative practices that the Buddha often recommends both to the monastics and to the lay practitioners, called the 6 recollections. So this is a set of 6 sort of reflective contemplations, which actually can turn into profound meditative practices, culminating in a samadhi, a state of concentration. And of the 6 recollections, among the 6 recollections, let's say the 6 recollections begin with recollection of the Buddha, but then move on to recollection of the Dhamma, then comes recollection of the Sangha, recollection of sila or good conduct, generosity, and recollection of the deities. And so we find amongst the 6 recollections the recollection of the Dhamma, and it's in that formula for recollection, for recollecting the Dhamma, that we find the Dhamma described as directly visible. So what I want to do is first to share my screen and then examine the terms that he used to describe the Dhamma, and then take a number of texts which highlight the ways in which the Dhamma can be seen as directly visible, or visible here and now. So let me share my screen. Whoops. Okay. So now I'm taking the formula for the recollection of the Dhamma from the Anguttara Nikaya. This is what I translated as the numerical discourses of the Buddha. And it's in the Book of Sixes because this recollection occurs as one of the 6 recollections. And so here we have the text that the noble disciple recollects the Dhamma thus, that the Dhamma is well expounded by the Blessed One, that's the Buddha, directly visible, immediate, inviting one to come and see, applicable, to be personally experienced by the wise. I'm going to come back and look at each of these terms in greater depth, but let's continue with this passage because it highlights the benefit of practicing this recollection of the Dhamma. So it says that when a noble disciple recollects the Dhamma in this way, on that occasion his, or we say her, mind is not obsessed by lust, hatred, or delusion. So when the mind becomes deeply deeply engaged with this recollection of the Dhamma, then these root defilements, lust, hate, or delusion, don't have the chance to overwhelm the mind. Of course, this takes persistent, consistent, and dedicated practice over a continuous period of time. So when the mind is not obsessed by these defilements, then the mind becomes straight based on the Dhamma. Okay, then when the noble disciple, when the mind becomes straight based on the Dhamma, then one gains inspiration, uplifting joy in the meaning or the goal. One gains this inspiration, uplifting joy in the Dhamma. One gains joy connected with the Dhamma. Now, these are important terms that show the progress of the practice, that show the progress in contemplation. So as lust, hate, and delusion are sort of swept away, put aside, and as this inspiration floods through the mind, then a kind of joy arises. And then when that joy becomes intensified, then piti arises. Here it's translated rapture. It's really difficult to find a good English word for piti. maybe now I think I use elation, uplifting, powerful uplifting joy. Then when the mind is filled with that uplifting joy, then the body and the mind become tranquil, sort of all of the disturbances settle down. And when the body and mind are suffused with that tranquility, then one experiences sukha, here pleasure or happiness. And as one is experiencing this sukha, this very pure, peaceful pleasure, the mind becomes concentrated. And the verb here is samadhyati, which is the verb corresponding to samadhi. And so in this way, one develops a kind of samadhi, a state of deep concentration that arises through recollection of the Dhamma. Okay, so that is the sort of the stages of progression in practicing contemplation of the Dhamma. And then once the mind gains this state of concentration, one can then turn the mind towards the development of insight or vipassana. So in itself, this is a kind of samatha practice or samadhi practice, but it can serve as the basis for vipassana or insight. Okay, now we want to look in finer detail at these attributes of the Dhamma mentioned in that formula. So we have first that the Dhamma is said to be well expounded. So this is swakato. So that's from su, which means well or good, plus a kato, expounded. Then the key word that I'll be dealing with is sanditiko. This is the word that I translate directly visible, and it's from the prefix sam, which has an intensifying function, plus the root das, from which we get dasana, seeing. So this is a kind of direct seeing. Then the Dhamma is said to be a kaliko, and this word is formed as a negation of kala, time. So kala is time, and what does not pertain to time is akala, and the adjective based on this is akaliko. And I render this as immediate, something that brings immediate benefits without requiring a long duration of time. Then the Dhamma is said to be ehipassiko, which is an interesting compound from the verb or the imperative ehi, which means come, a kind of request, come, and another request, passa, see. So literally, the Dhamma is calling out, come and see. And so I translated this inviting investigation, but more literally, it's a teaching, a path, a practice, which is calling out and saying, come and see it for yourself. Okay, the next word in this description of the Dhamma is a little problematic. It's opanayako, which it seems to be based on the verb upaneti, which means literally to bring near. So it's a little hard to understand exactly what's intended by opanayako, but I took it in the sense that the Dhamma is something that is to be applied to oneself, to be applied to one's own life. And so I sort of took a chance and rendered it applicable. Other translators have used leading onward or leading to emancipation, but I'm not sure that that's the original intention. Okay, and then the last of these 6 attributes of the Dhamma is pacitang veditabo vinyuhi. translated to be personally experienced by the wise. And this is from the word pachatung, which means by oneself, so personally or individually, and vedittabha, something to be understood, to be experienced, to be realized, but it's not to be realized by anybody, by an ordinary, unwise person, but it's to be realized vinyu, by the wise. But since we've adopted the Dhamma as our own path, at least we could consider ourselves to be wise people, at least people who have enough wisdom to be able to take up the Dhamma and apply ourselves to the practice and realization of the Dhamma. Okay, so this sort of takes care of the formula, explains that classical formula for the Dhamma. But now I want to look at some texts that bring out the nature in which the Dhamma is said to be, particularly we're highlighting this one, directly visible. Okay, so here we come to a sutta. Again, we're still in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Sixes, and a certain wanderer by the name of Molliya Sivaka comes to the Buddha, and he's heard this expression. Probably people have been telling him that the Buddha teaches a directly visible Dhamma, Sanditthiko Dhammo. So he comes to the Buddha and he says that it is said, a directly visible Dhamma, a directly visible Dhamma. In what way? And then he uses all 5 of those expressions. In what way is the Dhamma directly visible, immediate, inviting one to come and see, applicable to be personally experienced by the wise? And then the Buddha doesn't give a direct answer, but he's going to use the kind of interrogation method of getting his visitor, Sivaka, to give the answers himself through a course of questioning. So the Buddha says, I'm going to ask you questions about this, answer as you see fit. And then he asks him, what do you think when there is greed within you, greed or lust? Do you know there is greed within me? And when there is no greed within you, do you know there is no greed within you? He says, yes. Okay, we could just jump down. I'll come back to this passage. So he poses the same questions. When there is hatred within you, when there is delusion within you, do you know there is delusion within me? And when there is no delusion within you, do you know there is no delusion within me? And he replies, yes. Okay, so now the Buddha says, since when there is, could just put them all together. Okay, so just combining them all. So when there's greed, hatred, and delusion within you, you know there's greed, hatred, and delusion within me. When there's no greed, hatred, and delusion within you, you know there's no greed, hatred, and delusion within you. In that way, the Dhamma is directly visible, immediate, and so forth. And then when the Buddha gives that state explanation, Sivaka exclaims, excellent Bhante, excellent Bhante. And he goes for refuge to the Buddha. Now, what I find especially interesting and even fascinating in this passage is that, you see, when we hear that the Dhamma is directly visible to be realized by the wise, you think necessarily to be able to say that about the Buddha, you have to reach some state of high, profound realization. But here the Buddha is saying that even when there is greed, hatred, and delusion in the mind, the root defilements, and maybe all of the other defilements that branch out from greed, hatred, and delusion, even when you recognize the presence of those defilements in the mind, when you see into the workings of your mind and you can identify these defiled states in the mind, even in that way, the Dhamma is directly visible. And this, I think, sort of highlights quite an important point for us as practitioners. So we're inclined to think that when we're having a lot of mental afflictions, when the mind is overrun by disturbing and distracting thoughts, that we're not successful practitioners of the Dhamma. But the starting point for proper practice is to be able to see into the nature of our own mind and to understand the workings of the mind. And this particular passage that we've come across here ties in with another passage that we find in the Satipatthana Sutta. Probably all of you are familiar with this sutta. And in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha lays down what are called the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 ways of establishing mindfulness. And the third of these is contemplation of the mind. And here the Buddha opens the passage by saying, how does one dwell contemplating the mind in the mind? And the answer is that one knows a mind with lust as a mind with lust, and a mind without lust as a mind without lust. One knows a mind with hatred as a mind with hatred, a mind with delusion as a mind with delusion, and similarly a mind without lust, without hatred, without delusion. And so when these defiled states like lust, hatred, and delusion arise, again we could see that when we know the mind that's associated with lust, hatred, and delusion, when we identify it as such, we are at that time, we're practicing the contemplation of the mind. We're actually developing a foundation of mindfulness. And this provides us with one of the keys to sort of overcoming, reducing, and weakening, and even temporarily eliminating these defilements. Because in order to overcome them and to eliminate them, we first have to be able to recognize them. So when we recognize the mind is overcome by these defilements, then we know that to progress on the path, we have to work at overcoming and eliminating lust, hatred, and delusion. And then we will know the appropriate remedy for dealing with these defilements. My own teacher in Sri Lanka, the German monk Venerable Nyanaponika Mahatera, he published long ago a book called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. It was a popular book back in the 1960s. I think it's still in print. And in that book, he spoke about 3 stages in the development of Satipatthana, the development of the foundations of of mindfulness, or maybe 3 benefits of the development of satipatthana. The first, he says, he calls knowing the mind. The second is transforming the mind. And the third is liberating the mind. And so when we set out in our meditation practice, we use this practice of mindfulness in order to know the mind, to become acquainted, better acquainted with the workings of our mind. And we could see how this happens when we take maybe a simple, very simple meditation subject like mindfulness of breathing. And so we begin the sort of development of meditation with mindfulness of breathing, because the breath is a kind of colorless meditation subject. It doesn't have any particular flavor of its own, not a very distinct focus in the mindfulness of breathing. It doesn't arouse emotions of faith and devotion, like recollection of the Buddha. It doesn't arouse great expansive emotions, like the meditation of loving kindness. It doesn't generate a kind of repulsion, like the meditation on death or on the parts of the body. But we just take the task of trying to keep the mind on the breath, to follow the movement, the in and out movement of the breath. Now, for almost all practitioners, except maybe a few people who have very powerful paramis or virtues or merits from past lives, for almost all of us, we find that when we're trying to observe the breath, to follow the movement of the breath, thoughts, emotions, memories will come, plans, hopes, expectations will come flowing into the mind. Thoughts will come popping into the mind, sometimes neutral thoughts, sometimes emotionally laden thoughts. And what one does, one of the aspects of practice in satipatthana, is to label, to identify the nature of the thoughts that come into the mind. And so what happens in our ordinary life without this tool of meditation practice is that our thoughts govern our lives. We become, in a sense, servants to our thoughts. The thoughts are like a puppet master, and we ourselves are like the puppets controlled by our thoughts. The thoughts take on the quality of being, even we could say, obsessions or drives, powerful, motivating factors of which we're sort of not fully consciously aware, and therefore we are governed by these thoughts. But once we try to direct the mind to a simple object of observation, this is like putting a white background, like a screen, behind the process of thinking. So now the thoughts can show up clearly on that screen. When we identify them, usually we can say the thoughts, when we want to identify them, we find that the thoughts usually can fall first into 2 categories with regard to time, either referring to the future or to the past. And then when we home in more specifically on the thoughts referring to the past will be pleasant memories, things that we're trying to recapture, or unpleasant memories, particularly memories of things that have been done to us, that have hurt us, things that made us upset or angry. or else we just drift in sort of vague, nostalgic thoughts about the past. When we think about the future, we could identify the thoughts as involving hopes for the future, desires for the future, plans for the future, or fears and worries about the future. And so or else they can be just the kind of vague, indistinct thoughts referring to the future. And so if we want to identify more precisely these thoughts, we would see that the thoughts referring to the past, if they're thoughts about pleasant things in the past and a kind of clinging to those memories, we would see that those are thoughts governed by greed or lust. Even though the English word lust is rather strong, but the Pali word raga can cover those kind of thoughts. And when we have memories full of resentment and anger about things that occurred in the past, those would be thoughts that are governed by hatred or aversion. And when we're just drifting in dull, nostalgic memories about the past, those would be thoughts governed by delusion. And so in this way, we start to understand the workings of our mind through memories of the past. And similarly, with thoughts about the future, our hopes and expectations and desires regarding the future will be thoughts governed by greed or lust. The thoughts of fear, anxiety, and worry about the future will be thoughts governed by hatred or by ill will or by aversion regarding the future. And that kind of dull expectations about the future will be thoughts in which delusion is prominent. And so we begin by homing in, by labeling and identifying the thought processes. And in this way, we come to a greater understanding of the mind, to know the mind. And then we come to the process of transforming the mind. So how do we transform the mind when it's governed by greed, driven by hatred, driven by delusion? And this is where the Buddha's teaching is almost like, you could say, it's like a rich medicine cabinet full of many different medicines. And just as there are different illnesses, different people have different illnesses, and different medicines will be more appropriate for one person rather than another person, so these different medicines, these different tools or techniques that the Buddha lays out can be used by different people for transforming the mind. And so one of these sort of formulas, common formula that we find in the text is when greed is prominent, and particularly when it takes the form of sensual lust, especially sexual lust, sort of the tool that's used for transformation, maybe we could put this a subcategory, is the contemplation of asubha. And I'll come to that. The remedy for lust. In an ayad, recollection of death, or we could say for worldly greed. Okay, so the remedy when the mind is constantly overwhelmed by sexual fantasies, by sensual lust, the remedy that the Buddhist texts offer is called the asubha, and this is contemplating the nature of the body, to see into the nature of the body. Of course, the body is the object of lust, And so one examines the body in terms of, there's a formula of 32 constituents, but these can be reduced to contemplating the tissues, organs, and fluids of the body in order to see that the body itself, when you really examine it with this microscope of analytical investigation, is not really beautiful and attractive. But for worldly greed, the greed for, we could say, for wealth, fame, position, this is my own personal opinion, the remedy for this is the recollection of death. Since when we reflect that, after, it depends on how old you are. Now, I'm almost 80, so I have to reflect that if I have a long life ahead of me in 10 years, whatever wealth, fame, position I acquire, that will be gone. So you reflect that all worldly acquisitions have to be relinquished when death comes, and then that worldly greed will diminish and can be relinquished. Okay, then for transforming ill will or hatred, we have the remedy for this is the development of metta, or loving kindness. And so this is sort of systematically, methodically, starting with different groups of people, but reflecting on the fact that all other human beings, in fact, all living beings, just like oneself, want to be well, happy, and safe. And then one uses that as a systematic practice, not just a casual practice, but one in stages, one works through different groups of people, categories of people, generating towards them the wish that they might be well, happy, and safe. And in this way, through persistent, patient, dedicated practice, the ill will and aversion can be transformed, eliminated, and turned into loving kindness or goodwill, the wish for the well-being and happiness of others. And then there are different stages of delusion, but the ultimate sort of remedy for delusion is the development of insight, since the fundamental delusion is the sort of false conceptions of that things are permanent, provide some kind of security, safety, secure basis of happiness, and that things can be identified, particularly the factors of body and mind, that they can be identified as myself, clung to as myself. And so the remedy for delusion is to develop insight into the three characteristics of anicca or impermanence, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, and anatta, non-self. Okay, so this is sort of the standard method of dealing with the root defilements, using the antidote, applying the antidote. But there is another method that I found falls more properly within the scope of the Satipatthana method, and this is what I would call directly focusing on the state of mind and observing that state of mind. And so, for example, when the mind gets overcome by, when, say, a state of sensual desire arises, and one is trying to focus on the breath, using the breath as the primary object, but the sensual desire keeps on arising. And so one has a lot of trouble keeping the mind on the breath. So the particular technique that I found useful is you put aside the primary object, the breath, and focus upon the mind itself, watching the thoughts of, in this case, sensual lust arise, and just keep on watching each thought as it arises. And as one does so, one finds that the thoughts lose their emotional force and become just simply empty thoughts arising without that compelling punch that comes from sensual desire. And similarly, when thoughts of anger or hatred or resentment arise, one is trying to keep the focus on the breath, breathing in, breathing out, but these thoughts of anger, hatred, ill will are arising. And so what one does is one puts the breath aside and one just focuses upon the thoughts of anger and ill will arising in the mind. One observes the emotional coloring of those thoughts. And as one does so, the emotional coloring starts to fade away, and there just remains the thought. And the thought, without its emotional coloring, loses its force and drops away. So this becomes, in a sense, confirms what the Buddha says. Whoops. That when there is greed, or we can say lust within you, you know there is lust within me. When there is hatred within you, when there's delusion within you, first you know that these states are within you. And knowing is not just sort of noting it intellectually, but it means that you actually look into the working of the mind, and you're able to clearly identify these states and observe them. And as you observe them, they start to lose their force, their emotional force, and then you see them simply as thoughts. And as you are observing them simply as thoughts, what you are noting is that these thoughts are impermanent, that the thoughts arise, they remain there just for a moment, and then they pass away. And you start to see, as you're observing the flow of thoughts, you start to see more deeply the working of the mind, how the mind itself, what we call the mind, is just a process of thoughts arising and passing away in rapid succession. First, the observation of the process of the mind will be rather sluggish. So the thoughts seem to be persisting for some time, but as one gains the ability to attend more consistently and more precisely to the working of the mind through the increasing power of concentration, one sees the mind start to break up into a kind of kaleidoscope, or a procession of rapidly changing thoughts. Sometimes there'll be defiled thoughts, thoughts of greed, anger, delusion, sometimes just vague thoughts. But as one observes, one sees that the mind just flows on as a succession of thoughts arising, persisting, and rapidly coming to an end. And so this brings or highlights the anicca, the impermanent nature of the mind. And when thereby one sees that within the mind, there's nothing to rely upon as a basis for personal identity. So the mind itself is dukkha, unsatisfactory, even subject to suffering. And since the mind is impermanent, arising and vanishing, you could see that the mind cannot be identified as a self, as something that I truly am, a true I am. And so simply directing the mind to to its own workings and observing the flow, the procession of thoughts underscores and highlights the three characteristics within the mind. And as one sees ever more deeply into the three characteristics of the mind, this will gradually bring about the liberation of the mind. Even at first, temporarily, the mind will be liberated from the grip of greed, hatred, and delusion. But as the insight goes to deeper and deeper levels, this is according to the Buddha's teaching, this insight into three characteristics will bring about the eradication, the ultimate uprooting or eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion. And that is the final goal of the teaching. And so we find even some suttas in which the Buddha speaks about, he uses the same descriptive terms that he uses for the Dhamma to describe Nibbana. So here a Brahmin comes to the Buddha and says that Nibbana is said to be sanditiko. Nibbana is said to be directly visible. How is Nibbana directly visible? And then the Buddha says that here we have a person who's excited by lust, overcome by lust, full of hatred, overcome by hatred, who is deluded, overcome by delusion, obsessed by it. And then this person, governed by these defilements, intends for his own affliction, the affliction of others, the affliction of both. But when greed, when lust, hatred, and delusion are abandoned, then one doesn't intend for one's own affliction, the affliction of others, or the affliction of both. In that way, the Buddha says, sort of in a sort of figurative sense, Nibbana is directly visible. But then he says that when one experiences the complete destruction of lust, the complete destruction of hatred, the complete destruction of delusion, in that way, we could say that is in the ultimate sense, Nibbana is directly visible, immediate, inviting one to come to see, applicable to be personally experienced by the wise. And it's through this practice of the Dhamma, this gradual practice of the Dhamma, that begins by recognizing greed, hatred, and delusion when they're present in the mind and working to transform them, that we can ultimately liberate the mind from greed, hatred, and delusion and experience that ultimate Nibbana for ourselves. Okay, I wanted to leave some time for questions, so maybe that will do for my basic talk. And maybe now I'll stop the share so that we could all see each other.
Thank you, Venerable, for the outstanding lecture on directly visible Dhamma with illustration from the Anguttara Nikaya and the Satipatthana Sutta. Your insight and systematic explanation of the three stages in the development of Satipatthana were incredibly profound and valuable. And we deeply appreciate the time and effort you're putting into sharing your knowledge with us today. So we will now begin our question answer session. Kindly submit your questions in the chat box. I have seen some question here. So the first question I want to raise, Bhante, in what ways can we incorporate the understanding of the directly visible Dhamma into our daily, everyday lives?
Okay. It seems to me that the instructions that the Buddha gives, that the answer that the Buddha gives to the question of that wanderer, Sivaka, already deals with that issue. So the Buddha sort of lays down a particular template for how we can understand the workings of our mind by first laying out the root defilements, greed or lust, hatred, and delusion, and then sort of advising us to be able to identify those states when they arise in the mind. But one of sort of the problems that one would face in everyday life, and I think I pointed this out in the talk, is that without a sort of systematic practice, it's very difficult to identify those states that are popping up and governing the workings of our mind. So that is why it's quite important to have a kind of basic meditation practice, even if it's only for a rather limited period each day, even say 20 minutes, 30 minutes, if one could afford that. And that will help one to become, as one works with a simple meditation subject, like the mindfulness of breathing or the rising and falling movement of the abdomen, trying to keep the mind on a single object provides a kind of microscope for seeing into the workings of one's own mind. And that will show the particular, like different people have different character types, and that character type is determined largely by the thoughts that come up, the individual thoughts that come into the mind. And so we look into the mind and start identifying these thoughts. And some people will see that they have a greed temperament. Others have an angry or hating temperament. Others might have a conceited temperament. I think I just lost the whole screen.
Somebody. Okay.
So, okay. Yeah, so one begins by sort of identifying what are the kinds of thoughts that are arising in my mind. And then one could see, from the standpoint of mental development, what other practices do I have to include into my meditation practice to help to weaken those particular thoughts.
Thank you, Bhante. So we have lots of questions, so I will try to pick some questions. We may not be able to ask all the questions to Bhante, but I will try my best.
Okay.
First question, second question. Is the mind as the sixth sense organ observing thoughts? If so, how can I ever-changing mind is able to serve as an observer?
Repeat the question. I didn't quite.
Is the mind as the sixth sense organ observing thoughts?
Yeah.
If so, how can the ever-changing mind is able to serve as an observer?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And my answer will be somewhat theoretical. Okay, so what in my own attempt to understand what is going on, I distinguish two aspects to the mind. I call these the observe portion and the observing portion. Maybe you could call it the subject portion and the objective portion. And so it's even though the mind is always changing, but it's the subjective portion is watching the objective portion. And so we don't really have to go into try to figure it out theoretically, but if one just sort of puts it into practice, one could see what is taking place, that one could adopt a standpoint of mindful observation through which one is taking the mind itself as one's object. And when one takes that standpoint of sort of mindful, detached observation, then one can see the thoughts, emotions, volitions that are running through the mind. So that can be experienced for oneself. One might develop different theoretical frameworks for understanding it theoretically, but I don't find the theory to be so necessary. Just the practice is sort of confirms itself.
Thank you. Next question. Even by observing three poison, we can see the Dhamma. We do not have to be purchased for attending an enlightenment is a liberating thoughts. How do we overcome the heavy conditionality of karma that mind is buried under?
How do we overcome the
heavy conditionality?
The heaven conditionality of karma.
That mind is buried under. Enlightenment is a long way to go.
Yeah. Okay. So I say that first, we're all sort of burdened by this heavy weight of past karma, and also, excuse me, we're also burdened by this sort of force of what are called the anusaya. These are the latent tendencies, the latent dispositions that we've sort of built up and accumulated in our mind, according to Buddhism, through our thought processes, our activities in countless past lives. And so that is why the practice of Dhamma is the Buddha says it's a gradual process, a gradual practice involving gradual progress. We can't expect to jump instantaneously from our ordinary position to a stage of enlightened realization, but we have to work systematically through the different stages of Buddha's practice. And we have to do it, we have to bring together two factors, I would say, that have to balance each other. One is patience, that we have to work patiently, but the other factor is energy or vigor or determination. We have to work persistently. So patience and persistent effort, those two factors help us to weaken and to gradually overcome the karmic obstructions from the past and the sort of the motivating force of the latent tendencies that we've developed through our own activities and thought processes in past lives and in this life.
Thank you, Bhante. So we are running out of time. So I will pick two more questions, then we'll
Okay.
Could you speak more about the role of equanimity, upekkha, in a person's examination of their own mind?
The role of equanimity.
Yes.
Okay, well, I would say that when one is examining one's own mind, one is taking or trying to take a position of equanimity. Actually, the word that's translated equanimity in Pali, upekkha, or Sanskrit upeksha, comes from upa, which means close or near, and ikshati, to look at, to examine. And so one is drawing near to one's mind and looking at one's mind, but one is doing so without reacting, sort of without becoming joyful over sort of good experiences in one's practice, and without becoming dejected, disappointed, discouraged by difficulties that arise. But one just takes the stance of mindful observation, and as mindful observation builds up its strength, its momentum, equanimity will arise, the ability to keep a balanced state of simple observation. free from delight and dejection. So the Buddha, in the Satipatthana Sutta, he says, Vinaya abhijja domanasang, having removed abhijja. Abhijja is craving or grasping, and domanassa is disappointment. So with equanimity, one removes grasping and disappointment and just observes.
Thank you, Venerable. There's two hand raised. So I would, Venerable Sudharma, can you unmute and put forward your question? This will be the last question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Bhante. The passage that you read was very similar, I thought, to, I think it's in the 10s or the 11s. It's called The Prophet, where Venerable Ananda asked the Buddha about the prophet, the object of freedom from remorse, of morality, of sila. And he works through that kind of similar chain up to knowledge and vision. And I was just wondering, is this like a different formulation of the 7 factors of enlightenment? Because it kind of includes them, but it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah, it includes factors that are also included in the 7 factors of enlightenment, and in that sequence that you find both in Anguttara Nikaya in the 10s and the 11s. But that sequence, because it's 10, so it includes more factors. Okay. It actually goes on to the factors of insight. So the factors that we see in contemplation of the Dhamma, or the recollection of the Dhamma, goes up to samadhi, which is also mentioned in that sequence in the Anguttara 10s. But here, the Buddha doesn't go on to the other factors, because that involves turning the mind from samatha, calm, to insight. But as I said at the opening of my talk, that when you reach that samadhi through recollection of the Dhamma, then one could develop insight. Then you get to knowledge and vision of things as they are, and then the other higher stages.
Thank you, Bhante.
Sorry, because I ran out of time and we could not accommodate all questions. Once again, heartfelt gratitude to Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi for delivering outstanding talk. And I am pleased to announce that our next distinguished speaker, Dr. Ronald M. Davison, Emeritus Professor at Fairfield University in Connecticut, will present a lecture titled Initiation Abhisheka in Indian Buddhism at Kinloch Hall, University of West on November 5th at 4 p.m. So this is in-person lecture. So everyone is invited to attend. At last, thank you all attendees, and may you have a delightful evening. Thank you. Thank you, Vande.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Keep in touch.